Welcome to Mr. Kellen's Stories. How are you doing today? One unexpected moment, one night, one decision that changed their lives forever. She was just another woman at the gym, focused, determined, and ready to transform her body. He was her trainer, strong, disciplined, and carrying a past he never spoke about. But that night, everything changed. What started as a simple workout turned into something much deeper. Secrets unraveled, emotions ignited, and two hearts collided in ways no one saw coming. She never thought she'd fall for him. He never expected her to stay, but fate had already written their story, and the world wasn't ready for it. Will their love be strong enough to break the barriers, or will the weight of society tear them apart? Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because here at Mr. Keelan's Stories, every tale isn't just told, it's felt. Let's begin. The gym was nothing like Samantha had expected. The moment she stepped inside, she felt out of place. The air smelled of sweat and ambition, the rhythmic pounding of weights against the floor echoing through the massive space. Sculpted bodies moved with precision, dripping in determination. It was a world of discipline and perseverance, one she admired from afar, but never imagined being a part of. Samantha had always been career-driven, spending long hours at her desk, crafting marketing strategies and closing deals. But after years of putting work above her health, she finally decided it was time for a change. She needed strength, not just physically, but emotionally, to regain control of her life. Yet, as she gripped her water bottle and hesitated near the entrance, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The weight racks looked intimidating. The cardio section was filled with people who seemed to run effortlessly, and the personal trainers all appeared intense and laser-focused on their clients. And then she saw him, Jake. He wasn't like the others. While most trainers carried an air of superiority, Jake had a warmth about him. His deep brown eyes were filled with kindness, and his easy smile held no trace of judgment. His physique was impressive. Broad shoulders, a defined chest, and arms that looked like they had been sculpted from years of hard work. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught her attention. It was his energy. There was something about him that instantly put people at ease. Samantha observed him from a distance, watching as he patiently guided an older man through some stretches. He didn't rush or pressure, he simply encouraged, offering words of motivation with a tone that made even the toughest workout seem achievable. Just as she was about to turn away, wondering if she should leave and try another day, their eyes met. Jake tilted his head slightly, studying her for a second, before flashing that easygoing smile. It wasn't just polite, it was welcoming, like he had already sensed her nervousness and wanted to reassure her. "You new here?" he asked, walking over. His voice was deep, smooth, laced with a confidence that wasn't overbearing. Samantha swallowed, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Yeah. First day." "First days can be rough," Jake said, leaning against a treadmill casually, "but everyone starts somewhere." Samantha let out a nervous laugh. "I feel like I walked into a place where everyone already knows what they're doing except me." Jake grinned. "That's how it looks from the outside, but trust me, everyone here had a first day just like yours." He extended his hand. "I'm Jake, one of the trainers here." She shook it, surprised by how firm yet gentle his grip was. "Samantha." "Well, Samantha," he said, crossing his arms, "what's your goal? Strength, endurance, or just surviving your first workout without running out the door?" She laughed, the tension in her chest easing. "Definitely that last one," Jake chuckled. "All right, no running away then. Let me show you around." As he guided her through the gym, explaining different machines and offering tips, Samantha felt her initial hesitation melt away. There was something comforting about being around him. He didn't just talk at her, he engaged her, making sure she understood everything, ensuring she felt included. "So," he said as they stopped near the squat racks, "tell me something. What made you decide to join? Samantha hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted to open up to a complete stranger. But there was something about the way Jake looked at her, as if he truly wanted to listen, not just make small talk. I guess I got tired of feeling weak, she admitted, not just physically, but in general. I want to feel stronger. Jake nodded, as if he completely understood. Strength isn't just about lifting heavy weights. It's about consistency, pushing past limits and proving to yourself that you're capable of more. She bit her lip, processing his words. That actually sounds kind of inspiring. Good, he said with a grin. Then let's get started. Samantha hadn't planned on training with a personal trainer, but something about Jake made her trust him. And so, that day marked the beginning of something unexpected. Neither of them knew that this simple introduction, this chance encounter, was about to change both their lives forever. The days turned into weeks, and what started as simple training sessions soon became something more. Samantha had expected the gym to be just another task on her to-do list, something she forced herself to endure in the name of self-improvement. But Jake had changed that. He made the experience enjoyable, even addictive. It wasn't just his training techniques. Though he was undeniably excellent at what he did, it was the way he spoke to her, the way he listened. He never made her feel small for not knowing things. If she struggled with a new exercise, he encouraged her instead of judging. And somewhere along the way, between the sweat, the sore muscles and the shared jokes, something else began to develop. A spark. At first it was subtle. Samantha would catch herself looking forward to their training sessions a little too much. She'd notice the way her heart picked up speed whenever Jake adjusted her posture, his hands firm but respectful on her waist or shoulders. Their conversations stretched beyond fitness. Between sets, they talked about their lives, their passions, their struggles. Samantha told him about her demanding job, the pressure from her family to always be perfect. Jake, in turn, shared stories about his past, growing up in the Bronx, working twice as hard for half the opportunities, proving himself in a world that often judged him before he even opened his mouth. One evening, after an intense session, they sat together on a bench, catching their breath. The gym had emptied out, leaving just a handful of people behind. The air was thick with exhaustion and something unspoken between them. "You ever think about doing something else?" Samantha asked, taking a sip of her water. Jake glanced at her, amused. "What, like becoming an accountant?" She laughed, shaking her head. "No, I mean, don't you ever want to leave all this behind? The long hours, the constant training?" Jake leaned back, draping his arm over the back of the bench. "Nah, I love what I do. Helping people push past their limits, watching them become stronger, not just physically but mentally. That's the best part." Samantha studied him, realizing how much she admired his dedication. He wasn't just training clients, he was changing lives. "I wish I had that kind of passion for my work," she admitted. Jake tilted his head. "You don't?" She sighed. "I used to, but now it's just expectations, deadlines, money. I don't know, maybe I've been chasing something I don't even want." He was silent for a moment before saying, "Then maybe it's time to start chasing something else." She looked at him, and in that instant, she felt it, the shift. It was in the way he held her gaze just a second longer than necessary, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. It was in the way she felt safe around him, something she hadn't even realized she craved. And Jake felt it too. He wasn't blind to the way Samantha's eyes lingered on him, or how she laughed a little too easily at his jokes. She was smart, ambitious, and completely different from the women he usually met. She wasn't just beautiful, she had depth. But there was one thing standing between them, their worlds. Samantha came from privilege. She had grown up in an environment where connections mattered more than character, where appearances were everything. Her family lived in gated communities, attended galas, and expected her to settle down with someone from their world. Jake, on the other hand, had fought for everything he had. He had seen the world's ugliness up close, had been underestimated more times than he could count. He knew that for someone like Samantha, being with someone like him wasn't just about attraction. It was about defying everything she had been raised to believe. And yet, despite all that, despite the differences, despite the doubts, there was something real here. One evening, as they finished up another workout, Samantha hesitated before speaking. "Do you ever hang out outside the gym?" Jake arched an eyebrow. "Are you asking if I have a life?" She smirked. "Kind of." He chuckled. "Yeah, I do. Why? You thinking of joining?" She hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Training sessions were one thing. Stepping into each other's personal lives was another. But she nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I am." Jake studied her for a moment as if weighing the risks. Then, with a small smile, he said, "All right then, Samantha. Let's see where this goes." Neither of them knew it yet, but that night was going to be the beginning of something neither of them could walk away from. Something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, society, and themselves. The gym was nearly empty by the time Samantha and Jake wrapped up their session that evening. The scent of sweat and metal lingered in the air, the rhythmic hum of the last few treadmills filling the space. Samantha wiped the perspiration from her forehead, catching her breath after the intense workout Jake had just put her through. She had never felt this exhausted yet, so alive. Jake leaned against the squat rack, watching her with an amused smirk. "You didn't tap out this time," he teased, tossing her a towel. Samantha rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a grin. "I don't tap out, Jake. I just strategically rest." He chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah. Whatever helps you sleep at night." That's when she felt it again. The pull. The one she had been ignoring for weeks. The way Jake looked at her. The way he spoke to her. It was different. He wasn't just her trainer anymore. He had become someone she looked forward to seeing. Someone who made her feel things she wasn't ready to admit. She hesitated, gripping her water bottle a little tighter. Should she ask? It wasn't a big deal. Just dinner. Just two people eating together after a workout. And yet, she knew it was more than that. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke. "Jake, do you want to grab dinner?" For the first time since she met him, Jake actually looked caught off guard. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a moment he just studied her as if trying to figure out if she was serious. Then, after what felt like forever, his lips curled into that slow, teasing smile of his. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "I'd like that." The restaurant was small, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that didn't rely on fancy advertisements, but instead on the warmth of its atmosphere. Dim lighting, soft jazz playing in the background, the scent of spices and slow-cooked meals filling the air. Samantha had picked it at random, but now, as she sat across from Jake, watching him scan the menu, she realized how intimate it felt. Was this a mistake? "Something wrong?" Jake asked, setting his menu down. She shook her head quickly. "No, just didn't expect the place to be so quiet." He chuckled. "Would you rather have taken me to some 5-star rooftop spot with a dress code?" She smirked. "Maybe. You do look like you'd clean up nicely." Jake laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Flirting already? We haven't even ordered yet." Samantha felt her face warm. Was she flirting? She wasn't sure. But she did know that being around him like this, outside of the gym, away from the weights and routines, it felt right. As the evening went on, their conversation deepened. They talked about their childhoods. Samantha spoke about her strict upbringing, how she had always been expected to be proper and polished. how her parents had a plan for her life before she even had a say in it. Jake shared stories about his youth in the Bronx, about the times he had been judged before he could even prove himself, how he had to work twice as hard just to be seen as an equal. "You ever feel like people only see what they want to see?" he asked, stirring his drink absent-mindedly. Samantha nodded. "All the time." He looked at her, really looked at her, as if he was seeing something she hadn't even realized she was revealing. "Then maybe we both know what it's like to live in a box." His words hit her harder than she expected, because he was right. They came from different worlds, but in some ways they weren't that different at all. For the first time, Samantha let go of the expectations, the labels, the rules. She just enjoyed the moment. By the time they left, hours had passed, yet it felt like only minutes. Samantha stepped out into the crisp night air, stretching her arms. "I needed that," she admitted. Jake grinned. "Told you dinner wouldn't kill you." She laughed, shaking her head, but as she reached into her purse for her car keys, a sudden realization made her freeze. Her car. One look at the flat tire and she groaned. "You've got to be kidding me." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Damn, that's some bad luck." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't even know how to change a tire," he smirked. "Of course you don't." Samantha shot him a playful glare. "And you do?" He shrugged. "Grew up fixing things, cars, bikes, whatever needed fixing." He knelt down, inspecting the damage. "I could change it, but you're missing a spare." She groaned again, pulling out her phone. "Looks like I'm calling a tow truck." Jake checked his watch. "At this time, you'll be here all night." She exhaled, feeling the frustration settle in. Of all nights. That's when Jake spoke again. "My place is close by," he said casually. "You can stay over if you want." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She stared at him, searching his expression for any sign that he was joking. But Jake was calm, his offer sincere. There was no pressure, no hidden agenda, just a simple, practical solution. She hesitated. Should she? It was one thing to have dinner. Staying over. That was something else. But deep down, she trusted him. More than that, she wanted to spend more time with him. So she took a breath and nodded. "Okay," she said softly. Jake smiled, his eyes warm. "All right then. Let's go." And just like that, with one decision, everything changed. Neither of them knew it yet. But that night would mark the beginning of something undeniable, something life-altering, something that neither of them could walk away from. Samantha followed Jake up the worn steps of his apartment building, her heels clicking against the concrete. The city lights flickered around them, casting long shadows, and the distant hum of honking cars and late-night chatter filled the air. She had never done anything like this before, not just the staying over, though that alone was a bold move, but stepping into someone else's world, into a life so vastly different from her own. Jake led her to the second floor and unlocked the door, pushing it open. "It's not a penthouse, but it's home," he said with a smirk. Samantha stepped inside, immediately taking in her surroundings. His apartment was small, but full of personality. Unlike the sleek, cold, designer spaces she was used to, this place felt lived in. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with everything from self-improvement and fitness guides to poetry and philosophy. She hadn't expected that. Across from the books, a glass cabinet displayed medals and trophies, proof of his discipline, his victories. Framed photos were scattered around, mostly of family. A smiling woman who looked like his mother, a younger version of Jake with two little kids hanging onto him, and an older man who bore a striking resemblance to him. The air smelled of faint cologne and something warm, something familiar, like cinnamon and vanilla. "This is nice," she admitted, surprised by how much she liked it. Jake chuckled. "Didn't expect a trainer's apartment to have books, huh?" She turned to him, embarrassed. "I didn't say that." He shrugged, tossing his keys onto a small table. You didn't have to. She smirked but didn't deny it. Instead, she wandered over to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of the books. Didn't peg you as a poetry guy. Jake flopped onto the couch, stretching his long legs out. There's a lot you don't know about me, Samantha. She turned to him, meeting his eyes. Then tell me. What was supposed to be a simple overnight stay quickly turned into something much deeper. They sat on his couch, their bodies angled toward each other as the night stretched on. What started as small talk, jokes about gym horror stories and embarrassing moments, soon shifted into something more personal. Samantha learned things about Jake she had never imagined. He told her about growing up in the Bronx, how he had watched his mother work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, how his father had been in and out of his life, sometimes present, sometimes just a distant memory. I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to fight for it, he said, leaning back, his voice steady but heavy with experience. No one was going to hand me anything. Samantha listened intently, her usual world of privilege feeling more distant with every word. Jake had battled stereotypes his whole life. He recounted times he had been followed in stores, times he had been underestimated in school, times when clients at high-end gyms had doubted his skills until he proved them wrong. I worked my ass off to be here, he said, his jaw tightening for a moment. People see me now, successful, training in some fancy gym, but they don't see the years I spent being told I wouldn't make it. Samantha's heart ached as she absorbed his words. She had always known racism existed, in theory. She had seen it on the news, heard people talk about it, but it had always been distant, something that happened somewhere else. Sitting here, looking at Jake, a man who had faced it firsthand, who had pushed through it every single day, made it real in a way it had never been before. He wasn't bitter, though. He wasn't angry. If anything, he was proud of how far he had come, of how he had carved out a life on his own terms. Samantha, on the other hand, had spent most of her life sheltered. Her parents had given her the best of everything: private schools, luxury vacations, connections that made sure she never had to struggle. She had never thought about how different her life would have been if she had been born into another skin, another zip code. For the first time, she saw the world through a different lens, and it changed her. Samantha had come here as a guest, but now she felt something more. This wasn't just about a flat tire anymore. It wasn't about one night or one conversation. It was about understanding. Jake saw the look on her face, the way she had gone quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass absent-mindedly. "What's going through your head, Princess?" he asked softly. She exhaled a small laugh. "Just thinking." "About?" She met his gaze, deep, intense, searching. "About how much I don't know," she admitted. "About how much I took for granted." Jake studied her for a long moment before he smiled, not a teasing smirk this time, but something softer. "You're learning," he said simply, and somehow those 2 words meant everything. The space between them felt smaller now, the energy different. There was no mistaking it, the pull, the connection. Samantha felt her pulse quicken when Jake shifted closer, his arm resting along the back of the couch, his fingers just barely brushing against her shoulder. She should have been nervous, but she wasn't. She felt safe, like she belonged here. Jake's voice was lower when he spoke again. "I don't usually invite people into my space like this." Samantha swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Then why me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a second too long, and then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, "Because you see me." And just like that, something inside her shifted forever. The night had stretched on, hours slipping away unnoticed. Outside Jake's window, the city was alive with its usual rhythm. Distant sirens, laughter from the street below, the occasional honk of a taxi. But inside, in the dim glow of his apartment, it felt like a different world, a world where time didn't matter. Samantha curled her legs beneath her on the couch, the fabric of her dress soft against her skin. Her gaze flickered from the bookshelves to the framed photos to Jake, who sat beside her, one arm draped casually over the couch, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, focused, on her. She felt it, the pull, the magnetic energy crackling between them, growing stronger with every shared glance, every unspoken thought lingering in the air. And it scared her, because this wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel this way about him. Jake was her trainer. Jake was from a world different from hers. Jake was everything she had been warned about, everything society had told her to avoid. And yet, he was the only thing that felt right. The clock on the wall struck midnight, its soft chime breaking the silence. Samantha's heart pounded as she swallowed back the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She reached out before she could stop herself. Her fingers brushed against his hand, tentative at first, testing. Then slowly she laced her fingers through his. Warm, strong, safe. Jake didn't pull away. Instead, his thumb traced gentle circles against the back of her hand, a silent reassurance, a quiet acceptance of something neither of them could put into words. "I wish the world wasn't so unfair," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. Jake exhaled softly, his dark eyes searching hers. "We can't change the world in one night," he murmured, "but we can start with ourselves." His words settled into her like a weight, a truth she hadn't realized she needed to hear. They weren't just talking about society. They weren't just talking about the world. They were talking about them, about allowing themselves to want this, to lean into it, even if it was complicated, even if it defied expectations, because it was real, and real was worth the risk. Samantha had spent her entire life following rules, be proper, be poised, be everything that was expected of her. But now, sitting here, staring into the eyes of a man who had already rewritten every rule in her book, she realized she didn't want to follow them anymore. She wanted to follow her heart. Her free hand lifted, brushing lightly against his jawline. A light dusting of stubble grazed her fingertips, sending a soft shiver down her spine. Jake's eyes darkened slightly, his breathing steady but deeper, heavier. He was waiting for her to make the choice, to close the space between them, to take what they both knew was inevitable. And she did. Slowly, cautiously, she leaned in, not just physically but emotionally. She was letting herself fall. And just before her lips touched his, Jake whispered against her skin, "Are you sure?" Her chest tightened at the gentleness in his voice, because he wasn't rushing her, he wasn't assuming, he was giving her the space to decide, to be absolutely certain. Samantha nodded, her fingers tightening around his. Yes. And then, finally, he kissed her. The moment their lips met, the world outside faded. The differences, the barriers, the what-ifs, all of it melted away in the heat of the moment. Jake's lips were soft but firm, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was memorizing every second. He kissed her like he had been waiting for this, not just tonight, but for much longer. Samantha felt her heart stutter, her fingers sliding up into his hair, pulling him closer. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise that what they felt was real, a promise that no matter what, they wouldn't pretend this hadn't happened. That no matter what came next, they had crossed a line neither of them wanted to go back from. When they finally pulled apart, Samantha let out a soft, shaky breath. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his fingers still tangled with hers. Neither of them spoke for a moment, because words weren't necessary. They had just rewritten the story. And tomorrow, the world would be different because they had started with themselves. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the thin curtains, casting golden streaks across the apartment. The city outside was just beginning to stir, muffled honks from early commuters, the distant hum of subway trains, the quiet murmur of a world waking up. Samantha stirred, blinking against the morning light. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. The couch beneath her felt unfamiliar, the scent in the air different, warm, like cinnamon, and something undeniably him. Then it all came back. Last night. The deep conversations, the way their fingers had intertwined, the kiss that had changed everything. She sat up slowly, the soft knit blanket slipping off her shoulders. Jake must have covered her up after she fell asleep. The thought made her stomach flutter. He could have taken advantage of the moment, could have pulled her into his bed, could have done 100 things, but he hadn't. He had been a gentleman, respectful, thoughtful, and that made her fall for him even more. She rubbed her eyes, looking around. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint clatter of something in the kitchen. The scent of fresh coffee drifted toward her, rich and inviting. She smiled to herself. Jake. Samantha stood, stretching out the sleep from her limbs, and padded toward the kitchen. There he was. Jake stood at the counter, wearing a plain white t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders and grey sweatpants that hung low on his hips. He was focused on pouring coffee, the muscles in his arms flexing slightly with each movement. He looked unbelievably good, and for a moment, Samantha just watched him. Watched the way he moved, so effortlessly confident. Watched the way the morning sun touched his skin, golden and warm. Watched the way he belonged in his space, and yet, for the first time, she wondered if she could belong there too. He glanced up then, catching her staring. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at his lips. "Morning, princess," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "You hungry?" She chuckled, stepping closer. "That depends." "Are we talking protein shakes or actual food?" Jake laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that sent warmth curling through her. "I make real food too," he teased, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. Their fingers brushed as she took it from him, and even that small touch sent a thrill through her. Samantha took a sip, sighing as the warmth spread through her. "Okay, I'll admit it. This is better than the overpriced lattes I get every morning." Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "So are you saying I'm already improving your life?" She smirked. "Maybe." He raised an eyebrow. "Just maybe?" She tilted her head, pretending to think. "You'll have to keep impressing me," Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Your trouble." But his voice was fond, and his gaze, that gaze, was something else entirely. As the morning light filled the kitchen, Samantha felt a strange ache settle in her chest, because she knew what came next. She had to leave, not just his apartment, but the bubble of safety and warmth that last night had created. Reality was waiting for her outside that door. A reality where things weren't this easy, where people would judge, where her parents would never approve, where Jake wasn't just Jake, the man who made her laugh, who kissed her like she was something precious, but a statement, a relationship that would be questioned, scrutinized, whispered about, and she hated that the world wouldn't just let them be. She set the coffee cup down, exhaling softly. "I should probably get going." Jake's face shifted slightly, just a flicker of something in his eyes, something like disappointment, but he nodded. "Yeah, I get it." Samantha hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say here. She had never been in this situation before, waking up after a night that meant something. Finally, she turned to him, offering a small, sincere smile. Last night, it meant something. Jake held her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then slowly, He nodded. Yeah, it did. The simplicity of his words hit her harder than she expected. No over-explaining. No meaningless promises. Just truth. What happened between them was real, and that was enough. Jake walked her to the door, his presence steady, unwavering. As she reached for the handle, she felt his fingers brush against hers again, just for a second, just enough to send a silent message. This isn't over. She turned back to him, hesitating. Should she kiss him goodbye, say something more? But then she realized she didn't have to, because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. With one last, lingering glance, she stepped out into the morning light, her heart racing. She had no idea what came next, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to find out. The moment Samantha stepped into her office that morning, she knew something was wrong. The usual morning chatter, conversations about weekend plans, gossip about co-workers, seemed to hush the moment she walked by. A few of her colleagues glanced in her direction, exchanging knowing looks. Her best friend, Melissa, approached her desk, arms crossed. "Sam?" she started, her voice laced with something Samantha couldn't quite place. Concern? Judgment? A mix of both? Samantha set down her coffee and sighed. "Let me guess you heard," Melissa scoffed. "Heard? It's all over our group chat." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages at rapid speed before holding the screen up for Samantha to see. The texts flashed before her. Wait, she spent the night with him. You mean her trainer? The black guy from the Bronx? LMAO. I did not see that coming. I hope she's just having fun. She wouldn't actually, date him, right? Yikes, that's unexpected. She should be careful. That world is different from ours. Samantha's stomach twisted. That world. As if Jake was from some distant planet, as if they weren't all human. She exhaled, trying to keep her voice even. "Melissa, do you have something to say? Or are you just here to show me that my so-called friends are racist?" Melissa hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I don't want you to make things harder for yourself. You know how people are. You come from a good family. You have a reputation." Samantha narrowed her eyes. "A reputation for what? Only dating people who fit into a perfect little box?" Melissa gave her a pointed look. "Samantha, you know what I mean." And she did. She had grown up in a world of country clubs and private schools, where the idea of dating your equal wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Jake didn't fit their mold, and because of that, people assumed he wasn't good enough for her, but they had it backward. She wasn't sure she was good enough for him. Samantha straightened her shoulders. "Last night wasn't some mistake, Melissa. I like Jake." Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just be careful, okay? Don't let this be something you regret." Samantha held her gaze. "The only thing I'd regret is listening to people like you." Melissa blinked, taken aback. Samantha grabbed her bag and turned on her heel. She was done explaining herself. Jake had known it was coming. The moment he stepped into the locker room, he could feel the stares. His longtime friend, Marcus, was the first to break the silence. "Yo, so I heard you had some fancy company last night." Jake shrugged, lacing up his sneakers. "Word travels fast." Marcus chuckled, but there was something behind it. Doubt. "Look, man, I get it," Marcus said. "She's hot. Rich girl, out of your league. But be real, do you really think she's going to stand by you?" Jake frowned, tightening his laces. "And why wouldn't she?" Marcus leaned against the locker, shaking his head. "Come on, Jake. Girls like her don't fight for guys like us." Those words hit harder than they should have. Jake had heard them before, from teachers who doubted him, from employers who assumed things about him before they even knew his name, from people who believed the world had already decided his worth. He stood up, his jaw tight. I don't need her to fight for me. I need her to fight with me. Marcus studied him, then sighed. I hope you're right, man. Just don't get played. Jake clenched his fists but didn't respond, because deep down he knew this wasn't just about Samantha. It was about proving to everyone that they were more than the labels society had slapped on them. That evening, Samantha and Jake met at a quiet coffee shop, both carrying the weight of the day's events. The moment she saw him, she felt her chest tighten. She wasn't alone in this. He was feeling it too. They sat in a corner booth, sipping their drinks, the silence between them heavy. Then Jake spoke. They don't think you'll fight for this. His voice was calm, but his eyes searched hers, waiting. Samantha swallowed. Who? My people. Your people. His gaze didn't waver. They don't think we'll make it. Samantha set her cup down, meeting his eyes with unwavering determination. Then let's prove them wrong. A slow, knowing smile spread across Jake's face. That was all he needed to hear, and in that moment they both knew this wasn't just a fleeting connection. This was the start of something real, something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were like something out of a dream. Samantha and Jake fell into an effortless rhythm. Morning workouts, late-night conversations, stolen kisses under streetlights. The world outside whispered, judged, and speculated. But in their world, none of it mattered. They were just two people in love. But love wasn't always enough. Not in a world that still saw them as different. Samantha had known introducing Jake to her family would be difficult. Her father, Richard Davenport, was a man of old money and old traditions, raised in privilege, surrounded by people who looked and thought like him. Her mother, Claire, was softer but no less bound by expectation. She had been raised to believe in status, in reputation, in keeping up appearances. Jake, on the other hand, had spent his life proving he was more than a statistic. He had fought for everything, his education, his career, his dignity. And now he was about to fight for her. Samantha gripped Jake's hand as they stepped into the grand dining room of her parents' estate, a lavish space with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and a table set for an occasion far fancier than necessary. Her father barely glanced up from his wine. "You're late." Samantha forced a smile. "Traffic." Jake, ever the gentleman, stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Davenport, it's an honor to meet you." Her father eyed him, letting the silence stretch before finally shaking his hand. It wasn't a handshake, it was a test, a battle of strength, of power, of dominance. Jake didn't flinch. Neither did her father. Samantha swallowed hard, knowing this night was about to get a lot worse. Dinner was a war zone disguised as polite conversation. Claire asked about Jake's work as a trainer, trying and failing to keep the conversation light. Samantha's younger brother, Thomas, was indifferent, scrolling through his phone between bites of steak. But her father, he didn't bother hiding his disapproval. "So, Jake," he said, swirling his wine, "tell me, where did you go to school?" "NYU," Jake answered, keeping his tone even. "Full academic scholarship." Her father raised an eyebrow. "Ah, so a scholarship, I see." Samantha bristled. "Dad?" Richard ignored her. "And your family? What do they do?" Jake held his gaze. "My mother is a teacher. My father was a mechanic." "Was?" Jake's jaw tightened. "He passed away when I was 12. Claire shifted uncomfortably. Thomas actually looked up from his phone, but Richard simply took another sip of wine, as if nothing about that statement meant anything to him. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, though the words lacked sincerity. Jake forced a smile. "I'm not. He taught me how to work hard, how to stand on my own. He made me who I am today." Richard smirked. "And who exactly is that?" Samantha slammed her fork down. "Dad, that's enough." But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, fixing Jake with a cold, unwavering stare. "Look, I'm sure you're a fine man, but let's not pretend we're the same. Samantha comes from a different world, one you can't possibly understand. This relationship, he gestured between them. It's cute, but it's not real. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Jake didn't speak, didn't react, and that scared Samantha more than anything. She reached for his hand under the table, squeezing gently. Then she turned to her father. "Love isn't about color," she said, her voice steady. "It's about character." Richard scoffed. "Love is about reality, Samantha, and the reality is, people like him don't belong in our world." Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Good thing I have no interest in being in your world," he said. He turned to Samantha. "Are you coming?" She didn't hesitate. Without a single glance back, she left with him, and she didn't regret it for a second. Samantha had never felt so unwanted before. Her father's words echoed in her head the entire car ride to Jake's neighborhood, cold, dismissive, cruel. But the moment they stepped into Jake's mother's home, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth wrapped around her immediately. The scent of home-cooked food lingered in the air, and the small but cozy living room was filled with laughter. Jake's mother, Angela, was a petite woman with wise eyes and a voice that carried both authority and love. She took one look at Samantha and smiled. "So you're the girl who's got my son smiling like a fool." Samantha blushed. "I hope that's a good thing," Angela chuckled. "Depends. You break his heart and we'll have a problem." Jake groaned. "Mom," Samantha smiled. "I wouldn't dream of it." Dinner was different from the one at her parents' house, loud, chaotic, filled with life. Angela told stories about Jake as a child, laughing about how he used to challenge kids twice his size in races, how he once tried to fix a car engine with nothing but duct tape and determination. His younger cousins ran around, their laughter infectious. Samantha felt at home. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged, and when Angela pulled her aside later that night, her voice soft but firm, Samantha listened. "I know this won't be easy," she said. "People will talk. People will judge. But love, real love, it's worth fighting for." Samantha's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered, "and I will fight for it." Angela smiled, squeezing her hand. "Then welcome to the family, baby girl." The sun was setting as Jake led Samantha through the streets of the Bronx, his fingers laced with hers. The neighborhood was buzzing with life. Kids playing basketball on cracked pavement, old men gathered around a chessboard, music spilling from passing cars. "This is where I spend most of my time, when I'm not at the gym," Jake said, as they reached a worn-out community center with a faded mural of Martin Luther King Jr. on the side. Samantha read the words painted below it. "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase." Jake smiled. "I used to come here as a kid. Now I mentor." Samantha's heart swelled as he pushed the door open. Inside, a group of kids, ranging from preteens to high schoolers, were spread across the room. Some were lifting small weights, others were practicing boxing moves under the watchful eye of an older coach. A few heads turned. "Yo, Coach Jake," a little boy with wild curls called out, sprinting toward him. Jake grinned, catching him mid-air. "What's up, Marcus?" The boy giggled. "I finally did 10 push-ups without stopping." Jake set him down and ruffled his hair. "That's what I'm talking about. Hard work, little man." Samantha watched in awe as the other kids gathered around, their admiration for Jake evident in their wide smiles and eager chatter. Then a teenager approached, tall and lean with sharp eyes. "Who's the lady?" Jake pulled Samantha closer. "This is Samantha. She's important to me." The boy studied her for a moment before nodding. "Cool. You lifting with us today?" Samantha blinked. "I don't know how." Jake smirked. "Guess today's a good day to learn." The room erupted into cheers, and before she knew it, Samantha was standing in front of a squat rack, surrounded by excited kids, with Jake guiding her through her first set. As she struggled through the reps, she realized something. This place, this community, was more than just a gym. It was a second home. And Jake? He wasn't just a trainer. He was a leader, a role model, a man who was shaping lives. Her heart ached with pride. That night, as they walked back to his apartment, Samantha was quiet. Jake squeezed her hand. "What's on your mind?" She looked at him, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to help." Jake stopped walking. "Sam, this isn't your world." She shook her head. "It should be. Those kids, they need someone to fight for them. And so do you." His expression softened. "You think I need saving?" She reached up, cupping his face. But I think maybe I need saving from a life where I only ever looked at the world from one angle." Jake exhaled, his forehead resting against hers. "You really mean that?" She nodded. "Yes." And so they began. Over the next few weeks, Samantha poured her heart into the community fitness program with Jake. They raised funds for better equipment. They brought in new trainers. They started weekend fitness workshops that brought together kids from different backgrounds: rich, poor, black, white, Hispanic. For the first time, walls that had existed for generations were beginning to crumble. Even Samantha's family started noticing. Her mother showed up to one of their sessions, watching from a distance. Then Thomas came, and one evening, as Jake was teaching a group of kids how to deadlift, Samantha turned around and froze. Her father was there, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching, not judging, just observing. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. But when he caught her staring, he gave the smallest of nods, a sign, a step, a crack in the armor of prejudice, and that was enough, for now. The gym was alive with energy, laughter, clanking weights, the rhythmic sound of jump ropes hitting the floor. The community event had drawn in more people than ever before. Kids from the youth center were racing each other in the open lot. Parents stood in small clusters, watching with pride. Volunteers moved through the crowd, handing out water bottles and snacks. But amidst it all, Samantha's heart pounded for one person. Her father, Richard Davenport, stood near the entrance, stiff in his expensive suit, clearly out of place among the casual, bustling crowd. His eyes scanned the gym, pausing at the banner Samantha had helped design. Building Strength, Breaking Barriers, a community initiative by Jake Carter and Samantha Davenport. She swallowed hard. He had come, not because she begged, not because of some obligation. He came on his own. Jake, standing beside her, followed her gaze. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked toward Richard with the same quiet confidence he carried in everything he did. Samantha held her breath. The last time Richard Davenport had stepped into an unfamiliar world, he had been a young man on Wall Street, trying to prove himself. Now, decades later, he was in a different kind of world, one that forced him to confront everything he thought he knew. He watched as Jake crouched beside a small boy who was struggling with a push-up. "Hey, you got this," Jake encouraged. "Let's try it together." The little boy, no older than 8, nodded fiercely. Jake positioned himself beside him, demonstrating the movement, and soon the boy was beaming, nailing every rep. Richard's chest tightened. He had spent years assuming he knew best, that people like Jake were just different. But he had been wrong. Jake wasn't just some trainer. He was a leader, a mentor, a man of integrity. And worst of all, Richard had almost lost his daughter over his own ignorance. Jake finally approached, standing tall before Richard. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a move that shocked Samantha to her core, her father extended his hand. "I was wrong about you," Richard said quietly. Jake studied him, searching for any sign of condescension, any trace of the old man who once saw him as less. He found none. With a nod, Jake shook his hand. firmly, confidently, as equals. "It's never too late to change," Jake replied. Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat. This was bigger than an apology. It was the beginning of something new. As the evening went on, Samantha saw something she never thought she'd witness: her father talking to Jake's mother. Angela, ever the gracious host, smiled warmly as Richard awkwardly sipped the iced tea she had handed him. "So, Mr. Davenport," she teased, "you ever lifted a weight in your life?" Richard actually chuckled. "I played a little tennis in my youth." Angela grinned. "Tennis? Honey, that's cute. But let's get you under a barbell next time." Samantha almost choked on her drink. Her mother, Claire, sat beside them, listening intently. There was no tension, no forced conversation, just two families learning to exist together. And for the first time in her life, Samantha saw the possibility of a future where love defied every boundary. That night, as the event wound down, Samantha and Jake sat on the rooftop of his apartment, looking out at the city skyline. The stars were scattered across the dark sky, and a gentle breeze wrapped around them. Jake's arm was draped over her shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She smiled softly. One night changed everything. Jake turned to her, his eyes filled with something deep, something unchanging. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "And we're just getting started." He kissed her, slowly, deeply, with the certainty of a man who knew they had already won. Because love, in the end, had broken every chain, and there was no turning back.